This week in the UK, the Climate Change Committee published its seventh carbon budget, setting out what we as a country need to achieve to meet our obligations to achieve net zero by 2050. These publications often don't break through into normal news, but are often really important in setting out what we may do as a country in reducing emissions in response to climate change. I thought I'd do a video tonight to highlight some of the key recommendations that the Committee on Climate Change are making. And I'd encourage you to watch the video that they published if you had a spare 35 minutes. If not, here's some thoughts and comments from me in a little bit less time. So first of all, some context. Who are the Committee on Climate Change, or the Climate Change Committee? Well, they are an independent statutory body in the United Kingdom that advises the government on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and then also for preparing for climate change impacts. They've kind of got four responsibilities. So first of all, setting carbon budgets that they've done here. They also monitor progress on decarbonisation across the country. They advise on the steps that we might take, and they recommend policy for government to discuss and then potentially adopt. So a big publication like this, like a carbon budget, is an important time for politicians and for activists to understand where we're up to maybe to celebrate progress, to acknowledge where we're falling short. And it's an opportunity for the experts at the Climate Change Committee to share best practice in approaching this challenge. It isn't necessarily what's going to happen as a prediction or as policy, but it is what could be required to get to net zero by 2050. The key point is that the Climate Change Committee are independent of external interests and should be giving sensible, impartial, meaningful advice to government. And on top of their expertise in this publication, the CCC consulted a citizens panel of 26 people, members of the public selected to be broadly representative of citizens across the UK to gain insight into each key recommendations that they've put forward in each part of this carbon budget. So I think this is a pretty important report. And if we're agreed that we want to reach net zero by 2050, our economy and our energy system could look a bit like what the CCC are suggesting here. And if we want to do our part in reducing the biggest risks of climate catastrophe, in my view, we now need to deliver on their recommendations. Okay, so without just regurgitating everything they have in the document, I wanted to highlight some key points that I found interesting. So, first of all, achieving net zero will cut energy waste. I'm an engineer and I occasionally get a bit too excited about data, particularly if it's visualized in an interesting or engaging way. And there are lots of great graphs in this carbon budget, including a couple about how energy flows around our country. So this is what we call a Sankey diagram, and a Sankey diagram is a visualization of, in this example, where energy comes from and how it's used across our society. I love a Sankey diagram because the more you look, the more detail you see. And the report shares a diagram of today's system in 2025 as well as a potential system by 2050. I'll leave them on the screen here for a while so you can try and look at the detail. But the key things that stand out to me are, first, today, more of our primary energy is wasted than what is delivered for useful work. So what do I mean by that? Well, the heat and noise that's given off by a car, an internal combustion engine, those cooling towers at a power station, the plume of warmth that come out of a boiler flue, the noise that we hear when stuff is running, this is all wasted energy. And it means the energy we need to run those systems is more than the energy we're getting out in useful work. If you jump to 2050 to the decarbonised economy, the mainly electrified economy, we can see that losses have been halved and mainly come from the areas of the economy where we're still burning stuff. So in the future, where we're generating electricity cleanly, where we're using it to power electric vehicles and heat pumps, the lost energy is reduced substantially. And in turn, this means that we would need to generate less energy for the same purpose. This is a really good thing. Net zero, less waste. The second thing I noticed is the additional source of energy in 2050 coming from what we call ambient heat. which is really interesting. This is essentially the free heat that heat pumps are harvesting from the air outside to heat buildings. And seeing that figure of 200 terawatt hours of energy makes me stop and think a little bit. I'm not sure what it makes me think, but I do find it interesting. The third thing I notice is the limited role for hydrogen across the system in 2050. Hydrogen is a buzzword for many when we're talking about a low carbon future, but in this recommended pathway, it looks like it provides a small amount of useful energy to industry, to aviation fuel and to shipping, whilst demonstrating significant losses in the process. So what is it with all the hydrogen hype? The fourth thing I notice on this diagram is how much the low emission sources of energy will grow in the next 15 to 20 years. This really is transformative for our energy systems. These Sankey diagrams are full of information that the rest of the publication goes into, and I find them really interesting and helpful as a description of both today and a potential low carbon future. Okay, the next thing that jumps out, the second thing that I notice from the report, is that achieving net zero will reduce costs. And I guess this is a fairly nuanced point that they make, but they make it in a few different ways. One of the ways they make this point is that they suggest that there'll be an increase in how much we spend on our energy system over the next 10, 15 years as we begin to transition away from a fossil-based system. But that this investment will lead to a reduction in our costs in the 2040s. So transitioning away from this existing wasteful fossil fuel economy is costly, but has the benefit of reducing cost of living in the medium term. This is not just a sunk cost that will have no benefit. We're going to be building a more efficient energy system that will reduce costs across the country. Okay, next up, the third thing that jumps out to me is that not all low carbon technologies are at their same point in their potential or in their implementation. So one of the graphs that they use shows the levels of maturity of different markets for low emissions technology. And I actually find this really helpful from my perspective for a few reasons. First of all, it demonstrates the length of time that technology will be delivered around our country, the length of time it will take to deliver them. They outline that renewables for electricity are already a mass market technology, that electric cars are on a significant growth spurt but would still be classed as early adoption, that heat pumps, with only 1% of homes having them in 2025, are still at the start of the early adoption phase, if not still in an innovation phase, and then that novel technology like sustainable aviation fuel will remain in an innovation phase for the next 10 to 15 years, before potentially being used more in the 2040s. So showing the timescales involved with mass adoption of these technologies helps calm down some of the most excitable headlines about our grid not being able to cope with electric vehicles, or that someone is coming to force you to change your boiler. In reality, that transition will happen over a significant period of time. Although, again, the other side of that coin, it does worry and frustrate those of us who think that we could move more quickly, particularly on electric vehicles or heat pumps, because the technology is there, we just need to use it. And in many ways, we could move much more quickly. But I guess both sides of that coin, these graphs are showing that it's going to take some time to transition to a lower emissions economy. The next thing, the fourth thing that stood out to me is that they're predicting, or maybe they're recommending, that emissions in most sectors, except for aviation and agriculture, are falling to very, very low levels in the early 2040s, in the next 15 years. So the Climate Change Committee is making the point that there are some things that are still really hard to decarbonise, particularly farming and flying, but that for surface transport, for heating, for industry and for electricity, there is a lot that we can do in the next 10, 15, 20 years that would reduce emissions substantially. There's a lot of progress that can be made with the technology that's already in place, and again, we just need to implement it. The final thing that I notice, and I touched a bit on this earlier, but I noticed that there is some fairly clear, fairly robust language about the role of hydrogen in a low carbon future. So this carbon budget document simply says that there'll be no role for hydrogen in home heating. And this is something that there's been a load of discussion, debate, even argument about over the last few years, with trials for hydrogen heating announced and then cancelled, with incumbent energy industry trying to push hydrogen for heat quite hard. And what I read in this document is that just isn't going to happen. And if you're hoping that a magic fuel is going to come down a pipe that you can burn in your existing gas boiler, well, the Climate Change Committee says that this maybe shouldn't happen. It also says that hydrogen could have a very niche role in surface transport. So if you're waiting for hydrogen filling stations to pop up all around the country, well, stop waiting. It isn't really going to happen. It does say that hydrogen could play a role in long-term electricity storage. Okay, interesting. We'll see how that pans out. And in some industry as a low-emission source of energy, as well as being a feedstock for synthetic fuels. But I feel like, although there is hydrogen hype often from that incumbent fossil fuel industry, the reality will be much smaller than the hype suggests. I feel that clear communication on this is really important in focusing our minds on the solutions that are deliverable and that are already here. Okay, there is loads more interesting stuff in there, but those are the 5 areas that jumped out to me as I skimmed through today. What else did you find interesting in what you have read or watched? What might have I missed? And when you read or see reports like this, how do you feel? Do you feel excited or hopeful? Or do you feel intimidated, concerned, in panic or in despair? And with this pathway set out, what steps could we start taking in each of our contexts that would move us along that path more quickly? Okay, thank you for watching this. I hope that's been interesting and helpful insight. Do have a look at the video on the Carbon Budget page and do have a read through. I think you'll find it engaging content.